Antonio Gramsci, the Italian revolutionary, has been at the centre of many of the debates on the left. In Italy since the Second World War, where there was a mass communist party of which he was one of the founders, and really elsewhere since at least the 1970s. In particular, the Euro-communist currents, which were sections of the Communist Party that after 1968 began to distance themselves from a kind of blind loyalty to Russia and Stalinism, not, unfortunately, in order to rediscover the genuine revolutionary tradition, but to move to a much more open reformist position, embraced Gramsci and presented him really as an alternative to Leninism. I mean, I was radicalised by the miners' strike in the 1980s. I was desperately looking around in Richmond upon Thames. There wasn't a very big left and not many miners, I have to tell you. But I was desperately looking for something, and I found in W.H. Smith's in Kingston a magazine called Marxism Today, long forgotten but notorious in the 80s, associated with the Euro-communist wing of the British Communist Party. And to be honest, most of it I couldn't understand, but what it did tell me was that Gramsci was very important and had nothing to do with Lenin. And so the figure of Gramsci, who was probably the most well-known victim of Mussolini's fascist regime, helped legitimise this embrace of open reformism. And again, Euro-communism might sound obscure today, but the core leadership of Syriza, the radical left party in Greece, a tremendously important organisation, descends from the kind of Euro-communist current. So these arguments are still highly relevant. And in particular, it was Gramsci's writings in prison, his famous prison notebooks, that have been seized upon by the Euro-communist currents, by all sorts of currents in academia, as an alternative to Lenin, often putting an argument that says, a series of kind of contrasts saying that Lenin's methods were fine in the East, in backward Russia, but don't fit in the advanced parliamentary democracies of Western Europe. In Russia, the ruling class ruled through just force and coercion. In the West, it's through consent and ideological domination. Gramsci often used a military analogy. The war of manoeuvre, where it's an open clash for power on the battlefield, and the war of position, the kind of trench warfare of the First World War. And in other words, that in Eastern Europe, where the state was everything, you could talk about insurrection. In Western Europe, it was a much more drawn-out battle, the battle for hegemony, presented by Gramsci's Euro-communist enthusiasts essentially as a battle for ideas, a purely ideological battle, through a long march through the institutions of capitalist society, in which the need to have an insurrectionary movement that smashes the state essentially disappears. It's purely a battle of ideas. Often contrasted, some of the Gramsci's Euro-communist enthusiasts would contrast the battle for hegemony and ideas with what they would call economism. And for economism meant workers going on strike for higher wages, for better pay, for better conditions and so on. That was something that had to be sacrificed by workers in order to have an alliance with the progressive sections of the middle class. And this is the interpretation that has often been presented of Gramsci, where, if you like, the class struggle is at least pushed into the background, if not totally eclipsed, and that the state in parliamentary democracies is seen as something completely different to dictatorships. Essentially, it's the state's claim to be democratic is taken at face value, and the need to smash the state, the idea, as Marx and Lenin argued, that the state, at its core, whatever its democratic parliamentary surface, at its core, the state is bodies of armed men, and today sometimes armed women as well. That idea is rejected by the Euro-communists. Okay, now what I want to argue is that really is an abuse of what Gramsci stood for. At best, there's a few partial truths, but the overall picture is highly distorted. Okay, I want to say something, because maybe it's not widely known to everyone, about who Gramsci was, and then to try and draw out what he really stood for and what he really argued. Antonio Gramsci was a brilliant young intellectual, born in Sardinia at the end of the 19th century. The Italian state had only recently been unified. He grew up in a world of mass illiteracy. he moved to the great northern industrial heartlands of Italy and was won to the idea that the working class, increasingly militant working class in cities like Turin and Milan, was the key to transforming all of society. He was at the centre in Turin, which he later called Italy's Petrograd, of the Biennio Rosso, the 2 red years after the end of the First World War, 1918 to 1920, when Italy is convulsed by mass strikes, insurrectionary bread riots, workers in Turin seize control of the factories for a month and begin to run production under workers' control and protected by armed workers' militias with machine guns on some of the factories, where peasants in Italy's south are seizing the land, where there's mutinies amongst the army, and a complete paralysis of the state machine. In other words, a revolutionary moment, a chance to break the isolation of the Russian Revolution and spread the revolution to Italy. It didn't happen. By 1920, the movement was being defeated, and the Italian ruling class breathed a sigh of relief and then looked for revenge and turned to Mussolini's squadristi, the black shirts, the armed fascists who begin by attacking peasant organisations but ultimately seek to smash all of working class organisations, whether socialist, Catholic or communist. And we get the birth of the world's first fascist regime. By the mid-1920s, Gramsci has become the leader of the newly founded Italian Communist Party. He sits as an MP in a fascist-dominated parliament, a thorn in the side of the regime. In 1926, Mussolini moves to form a fully developed fascist dictatorship. They lift parliamentary immunity and arrest Gramsci. And famously at Gramsci's trial in 1928, the official prosecutor of the fascist state turns to the judge in his final summing up and says, pointing to Gramsci, "We must stop this brain working for 20 years. Now, it's worth just saying, because I think it's part of the immense attractiveness of Gramsci as a figure. I mean, people might not know. I mean, Gramsci was formed he was born with a malformed spine and only ever grew to 5 foot tall, and was afflicted throughout his life, and almost killed him as a child, with numerous illnesses. And whilst he's in Mussolini's jails, essentially the conditions of the jail eat away at his health and his life, and by 1937 would kill him. I mean, they released him to die in a clinic just so they didn't have the embarrassment of him dying in jail. I mean, essentially they kill him through destroying his health. But such is Gramsci's incredible willpower that as his body is literally disintegrating in front of him, he writes his notebooks, 2,848 handwritten pages of notebooks that form the basis of his prison reflections. They're often written in quite ambiguous language. He can't always be open about what he's saying to evade the fascist censors. So, for instance, in the prison notebooks, Lenin is always referred to as Ilich, one of his second name. Marxism is a philosophy of practice. He refers to the Revolutionary Party as the modern prince, which is an echo of Machiavelli's book, The Prince, the figure who would engage in a revolutionary unification of Renaissance Italy. So he uses an elliptical language that sometimes means there's ambiguities to his name. Nonetheless, I don't think there can be any doubt that Gramsci's prison notebooks, and I recommend it to people, is one of the most important contributions to Marxist theory of the 20th century. I don't think there's really any doubt about that. What's the core of Gramsci's arguments then in the prison notebooks? Which are really, I think, a reflection on this period. How is it you can have such a revolutionary opportunity at the end of the Second World War, and you end not with socialist revolution, but with the barbarity of Mussolini and the world's first fascist dictatorship? And his argument is, this was not inevitable. This was not automatic. It didn't have to happen. It took place because of a missing subjective factor. There was nothing about objective history that meant the movement went down to defeat. It was the absence of a genuine revolutionary party. And he tries to draw out some of these experiences and reflect on them. There was a mass party, in that period. Many people indeed saw it as a revolutionary party. It was the Italian Socialist Party, which had the most left-wing rhetoric you could imagine. I mean, think about, I mentioned Syriza earlier, or think about people we think of on the left in terms of mainstream politics like Tony Benn. It's much, much more left-wing rhetoric. Talk about dictatorship of the proletariat, the need for revolution, and so on. This is the kind of language that you heard. When the Bolsheviks initiated the establishment of the Communist International of revolutionary organisations in 1919, the Italian Socialist Party joined it immediately. Incredibly radical language. But it was also a broad church. It had militant workers like those in the factories of Turin that Gramsci was relating to. It also had open reformist MPs who opposed revolution, who were often quite deeply embedded in the powerful trade union bureaucracy of the CGIL, the main workers' union. In truth, there was no effective party discipline. Those who wanted militant strikes did militant strikes. Those who wanted to accommodate to the state accommodated to the state. There was no effective party discipline. In other words, there was a situation of really paralysis inside this organisation, where verbal radicalism went hand in hand with complete passivity. Complete passivity. And the theoretical expression of this was given by the key leader of the Socialist Party, a man called Cerati, who really had a position that said the economic power of the working class, sooner or later, will automatically translate itself into political power and socialist revolution. In the meantime, we don't need to prepare the ground for a seizure of power. In other words, history will solve our problems for us. We can just wait. And therefore, the Socialist Party did nothing to take the kind of practical and ideological steps to prepare the ground for workers to seize power. It took no steps to try and pull the mass of peasants who are seizing their land, demobilise soldiers who are mutinying and looking for a changed society, the discontented sections of the petty bourgeoisie. It did nothing to try and pull these around a working class that was looking to take power. And the resulting vacuum is seized by Mussolini and fascism. So what lessons does Gramsci draw from all of this? He does say that the task of socialist revolution in the West would be harder than it was in Russia. Actually, this was a commonplace amongst revolutionaries at the time. You find the same kind of statement in Lenin and in Trotsky, that the ruling class was much weaker in Russia. In the more developed West, they had more resources and it'd be a tougher battle. And in particular, that the ideological ties that bind the mass of the population to the system are stronger in the West, particularly because of the existence of dense networks of formal and informal organisations in what Gramsci would call civil society. So, in other words, it's not just about the state, it's the way in which the church, particularly important in 1920s Italy, political parties, trade unions, cultural associations, the family, the way all of these structures would help tie people to the existing exploitative social order. And that therefore, for Gramsci, what hegemony means, hegemonic struggle, is a twofold battle. Firstly, to free the working class from the ties that bind it to the system, and secondly, to bind to working class struggle all the other oppressed layers of society. In other words, for the working class to be a tribune of the oppressed. Now, I mean, it strikes me those are two particularly Leninist considerations in terms of what Gramsci is really thinking about. And what I want to kind of focus on, I think, is, and where I think it's very, very useful and very interesting for us today, if we want to think about the uses of Gramsci, is what Gramsci in particular has to say in the bits that are often not quoted in the prison notebooks, particularly the bits in the section, if you have a copy, called The Study of Philosophy, what Gramsci has to say about the shape of working class consciousness under capitalism and therefore the tasks of political leadership. Because Gramsci starts off by saying everybody has some conception of the world. He says everybody is a philosopher in that sense. Everyone has some thoughts about the nature of the world that they live in. The question is how systematic, Have people reflected? Have they rendered those ideas coherent, or are they episodic and disjointed, as he calls it? And he makes a very interesting distinction between what he calls in the prison notebooks common sense and good sense. Common sense for Gramsci are really the ruling ideas of capitalist society, all the kind of stuff that's drilled into us from birth about how the world works, that, I don't know, the kind of ideas you hear all the time, that human nature is inherently selfish, racism is just an inevitable fact of life, you always need a boss, all of these kind of ideas, that exploitation isn't inherent in the social order, all of these kind of ideas that just reflect the dominant ideas of our society and really reflect the ideas of the ruling class. And you contrast that to what he calls good sense, which is a real assessment of the position of workers' interests and position inside capitalist society that's based on the actual experience of collective exploitation that workers are suffering from. His most brilliant insight, I think, is this. He says, in other words, he's really saying you've got ruling class ideas at common sense, class consciousness is good sense. His brilliant insight is that he says the vast majority of people under capitalism have elements of both in their head. It's not the case that you just have one group of people that just have ruling class ideas, that believe every bit of filth put out by the ruling class, that believe everything in the Sun newspaper and all of the rubbish at all, and then there's this other group of people who just are, thoroughgoing revolutionaries. Most of the time, most people, and this will reflect our daily experience, have elements of both. They hate the bosses, think the bankers are overpaid, but think there's too many immigrants. Combine elements of good sense and common sense. And I'm going to read you a quote. It's quite a long quote, and I know it's quite hard sometimes to follow quotes when they're given, but it's the crucial one, and it's something that it's worth people returning to, and I'll try and tease out what Gramsci means by it. He says, the active man in the mass has a practical activity, but no clear theoretical consciousness of his practical activity, which nevertheless involves understanding the world insofar as it transforms it. His theoretical consciousness can indeed be historically in opposition to his activity. One might almost say that he has two theoretical consciousness or one contradictory consciousness. One which is implicit in his activity and which in reality unites him with all his fellow workers in the practical transformation of the real world, and one superficially explicit or verbal which is inherited from the past and uncritically absorbed. In other words, I think what Gramsci is saying here is that it's precisely that idea that people have a contradictory consciousness that involves an acceptance of ruling class ideas, but often the actual way they live their life develops experiences that point in a different direction. So the actual experience of being exploited means that you need to be in a trade union, that you need to have solidarity, that you might verbally accept that we always need a boss and that we need the market, but your boss is a bastard who's greedy and exploiting you. These ideas coexist inside people's head. That, again, that people might accept that simultaneously the idea that we're all British and therefore have a common interest, but also that there's them and us, an elementary embryonic sense of class divide. And crucially, Gramsci links class consciousness, good sense, to man's practical activity. Let's draw that out. What he's really saying is it's not just people's daily experience of class that teaches them class consciousness, but particularly when workers enter into struggle. Particularly when workers enter into collectively trying to change the world, even if it's just on a picket line, the elements of good sense become strengthened and become potentially developed. And therefore, just to really draw this together, what Gramsci's saying is, what's the task of a revolutionary party? What's the task of socialists? It's not simply to passively wait, as the Socialist Party did in 1920 in Italy, for the spontaneous struggles of workers to lead to class consciousness. Because unless socialists intervene in that battle between common sense and good sense, to try and draw out the practical experiences that point to class consciousness, to develop them, to generalise them, to make them more coherent, more systematic, workers won't be able to just automatically overcome those limitations and commitment to the old ideas. But nor is it the task of socialists simply to stand and lecture workers about correct class consciousness. You have to be involved and immersed in the struggles to take the elements of class consciousness that spontaneously emerge in any struggle and turn them into a fully rounded and coherent alternative to the system. In other words, at the centre of Gramsci's account is the interplay between spontaneity and consciousness, between the party and the masses. That's at the heart of his account about the way that socialists can overcome the unevenness in working class consciousness. And just to end, I mean, I think that, you know, it's not simply that Gramsci is a Leninist, and it's not simply that he provides a brilliant application of Lenin's ideas to the conditions of Italy in 1920, 21, 23, and so on. It's also that I think that this understanding of the way the combination of the experience of exploitation and the existence of ruling class ideas shape workers' contradictory consciousness, and what follows from that provides a theoretical underpinning to Leninism that Lenin himself, for various reasons, not least because initially Lenin didn't realise he was building a different kind of party. He thought he was building a similar kind of party than existed in Germany, only later discovering he was doing something different, and he didn't have time to theoretically generalise it. Gramsci provides a theoretical underpinning of Leninism that even Lenin didn't provide. And I think that I would thoroughly recommend, I mean, just to end, Giuseppe Fiori's biography of Gramsci is an extremely powerful read, and it's worth getting from a library. I think it's out of print now. But I think the Prison Notebooks, which, by the way, is a book you have to go back to more than once because it's not an easy read, but it's full of complete gems in terms of understanding class consciousness, is a brilliant defence of Leninism and highly relevant to the 21st century. Okay.
I mean, you mentioned Gramsci talks about civil society, and then the way he formulated it was that it was outside of the state, but I think that's actually a misrepresentation of how Gramsci talks about the state itself. He separates what a classical Marxist sort of refers to as the state apparatus as being coercive state apparatus, so like the government and the police, the judiciary, but then he also he refers to that grouping as political society as well. But then for him, civil society, which can mean things like the press, the trade unions, the religious institutions, the education institutions, to him they also form a part of the state because they function in the same way as impressing upon us the way that we exist within the system as being inherent or correct, and enforcing the sort of mode of production, the relations of production and reproducing those in workers. And I also think that when you talk about hegemony, which you sort of referred to as winning the workers to an idea and binding workers into an alliance, which is a very sort of Leninist interpretation of hegemony. And it is the one that Gramsci started out from. But I think at the same time, Gramsci then started using the idea of hegemony in much more varied instances. So he talks about the hegemony of bourgeois society in terms of how the control of the ideas that bourgeois society puts out, it then has the influence of bringing people towards that ideology and indoctrinating them to it at the same time. And that's the process of building consent for the current system. It's referred to as hegemony in that sense. So I think we need to be quite specific in how we use hegemony, because he sort of uses it in multiple ways. So there's the hegemony of the working class as a way to build people into a revolutionary movement, but there's also hegemony of bourgeois society at the same time, which is keeping people within the constraints that they're within. And I think that actually what develops from that is that you've got a dialectical relationship between these ideas of the working class and the ideas of the bourgeoisie, which is a bit of a hammy way to phrase it, but I'm kind of winging it as opposed to going through it. But the point is that when building kind of good consciousness, as he phrases it, as opposition to common sense, good sense in opposition to common sense, it's a recognition that there's a constant interplay between these two sort of competing ideas and the way that they're sort of influencing people. And so hegemony is used more broadly as a way to understand how people are drawn towards particular things and how they have influence in that sense, and then as well as it also being sort of a praxeological Leninist usage.
Just a question really. I haven't actually read much Gramsci, actually. In terms of this differentiation between good sense and common sense, can you just elaborate upon the actual differences or in accordance with his sensibilities and how he defined each?
Yeah, I think one of the very important lessons for me that I took away from Gramsci is the distinction that Gramsci makes between East and West. Means for revolutionaries trying to develop a strategy and tactics for socialism, for revolutionaries and non-revolutionary times, because what he seizes is that power, unlike in Tsarist Russia, where when you went on strike you would get shot and put up against the wall for leading a strike, that effectively trade union bureaucrats and trade union leaders who were leading strikes in Italy were being wined and dined. And I think that's something that effectively requires Gramsci to think very differently about forms of power and how power manifests itself inside of Italian society. And so what he says is, it isn't simply the state that when there's a strike that happens, bloodily cracks down on the strike. No, it can use the newspapers to say, look at that strike leader, what an immoral person, that on Sunday, after a riot has taken place, throughout the entire week, people go to church and the preacher says from the pulpit, look, these immoral bastards, trying to wreck our society. And so for Gramsci, the difference is that consent, that the fact that workers have to buy into the system on a day-to-day basis becomes very important in West in order to maintain ruling class power, ruling class hegemony. And that has an effect on people's consciousness. It means that the kind of spontaneous outbursts of struggle that we see, strikes, demonstrations, etc., I mean, they aren't very... In Russia, for example, you had the possibility in 1905 where a small demonstration over bread suddenly turns into a revolutionary upheaval. In Western Europe, where there are these mediating layers of power and institutions that people are bound into, effectively mass spontaneous action has a very hard time in overcoming the kind of bureaucracy, the kind of centralism, the kind of weight that lies upon people on a day-to-day basis. And I think that comes back to the common sense and the good sense, because if you want to understand how we can break through the kind of common sense ideas that prevail in our society, that we have to compete for jobs, or that all Muslims are evil terrorists, or all those kind of ideas that are being put upon us. Gramsci believes that those ideas start to become real material forces inside struggles, and in the same way that good sense ideas, those of cooperation, of solidarity, of love, and so forth, also become. And in real class struggles, those ideas get a concrete expression and are carried out. And from that, you can see how the working class is able to build a new layer of a new set of values that can actually start to lead concretely the project of socialist transformation. And I think the way we break through these ideas in the West isn't by simply indoctrinating people and saying, like, we'll exchange capitalist ideas with, socialist ideas. No, it's by furnishing and by, accelerating the kind of struggles that we see on a day-to-day basis, and effectively that can start to crack open that kind of, crap that we're constantly being fed in the media and whatnot.
What I know about Gramsci is basically what I've learned on the A-level civics. And the impression I get of Gramsci is that he's not as deterministic as other Marxists. So he focused very much on the individual. And one thing Gramsci talks about is in regards to religion, is how religion can sometimes be used against the hegemony or the status quo. So he talks about leaders like Otto Maduro in Colombia and South America, which were actually against the state, and they were labeled actually as communists. and even the Pope broke connection with them and disregarded them as religious leaders. So I wonder if you can comment a bit more on that view on religion from Gramsci. Cheers.
Any questions? Sam?
Well, I was going to respond on the religion thing. I mean, from what I've read of it, which hasn't been too in-depth, he's talking largely about the Protestant Reformation in opposition to the Catholic Church. So you had the Catholic Church, which had existed for 100 years. It established this sort of hierarchy of you go through the priest and then the bishop and then archbishop and then the cardinal and then the pope. So it sort of instills this sort of idea that there's a hierarchical system. It does all of its teachings in Latin at the time, so unless you read Latin you can't read the Bible because they don't produce it in English. So the way that the Catholic Church functioned was a reflection of the type of society, the type of means of production that existed within. And so in doing so it was sort of reinforcing those structures. Whereas the Protestant Reformation was about instead of having, all the way up to the Pope, it was much less hierarchical structures. It was driven from below. It led to translations of the Bible into English, so it's much more accessible to people. So people were actually able to engage with the ideas themselves and sort of develop what they were talking about themselves. So in this sense, and it also sort of coincided with like the urbanization, industrialization that was happening around the same sort of time. So in this sense, he sees sort of religion as reflecting the changing like structures of like the economic system, and then the changes of the way that people are sort of interrelating with each other at the same time is reflected in that push for a new type of religion. So to Gramsci, like the Protestant Reformation in that sort of moment was a very sort of I don't know if to use the sort of phrase revolutionary, but it was definitely like a progressive thing, that people were actually using religion as a tool to sort of bring themselves into sort of a renewal forum where they can sort of discuss these ideas and sort of develop themselves. Whereas what we've seen over time is that it's then become entrenched within Catholic society, so mostly the sort of Church of England functions in much the same way as the Catholic Church did, but it's just considered like not quite as bad or stuff like that. So you have like the way that ideas of religion are used is a reflection on sort of the way that society functions and what sort of changes are happening within it. Does that make sense? Or?
The thing is that I think you're referring to Protestants and maybe what happened in the US and stuff. But what I'm talking about is those cases in Latin America and South America as well, where you had priests working with trade unions and which actually challenged the system, and many of them were assassinated by the state. Yeah. So they're opposition to the hegemony. But yeah, I agree with
this. Just a few points. I think the point about the Gramsci's emphasis on the subjective is very, very important. Because what's the caricature of Marxism? I mean, it's certainly still the one that I got taught at school and at college, which is that Marxism is a form of determinism. In other words, there's a kind of inevitable march of history, primitive communism, slave mode of production, feudalism, capitalism, communism's inevitable, it hasn't happened, so Marx is wrong, right? And has no role for the individual and so on. And this is a different meeting, but that's a caricature of Marx's position. But that was very much the version of Marxism that was dominant before the First World War, a very deterministic version of Marxism. In fact, it was the version of Marxism really held by the leaders of the Italian Socialist Party that I mentioned, and it led to passivity, because if history is going to do it, if it's inevitable, why bother, really? You can just passively wait, and in the meantime get elected to the council, get elected to parliament, run your trade union branch. But no sense that you have to engage in a political fight to prepare the working class to seize power. And what's striking about all the key figures in the classical Marxist tradition at this moment around the First World War is all of them break from that. Not just Gramsci, but also Lenin, with his emphasis, I think, on the question of the party, and Trotsky, actually. And so, for example, there's a very famous essay that Gramsci writes when he hears the news of the October Revolution in 1917. I think it's in that book, which is, he calls it a revolution against capital, and it's a play on words, not just a socialist revolution in Russia, but a kind of a challenge to the version of Marxism where, you know, of Das Kapital, that put about this mechanical, deterministic force. If you accept that version of history, the Russian Revolution should have started in America or Britain, the most advanced capitalist countries. Instead, it started in one of the most backward, where there was a very small working class. Right? History didn't go according to this preconceived plan, and that Gramsci puts a tremendous emphasis on saying it's not inevitable. There are historical forks in the road, and don't we just see one here in 1920? There was a potential for socialist revolution. We end up with fascism, and which way history goes is decided by, not in circumstances of their own choosing, right, but by human beings and how they organise, what kind of arguments they put, what kind of networks they build, how they intervene in the struggle. And it was the absence of a party that really understood the interplay between mass struggles, spontaneity and consciousness and so on, didn't know how to relate to that, that meant that that revolutionary opportunity was missed, and you don't just carry on, you get barbaric reaction. I mean, the great French revolutionary Saint-Just once said, those who half make a revolution dig their own graves. The worst thing you can do is terrify the ruling class that they're going to lose all their wealth and power, and then back away from it and leave them with their wealth and power, because they will seek revenge. Brutal revenge, and this is exactly what happens. So I think that's a very, very important part of why Gramsci is so important. Your question about civil society, there's a longer discussion, because the truth is there are a lot of ambiguities in the prison notebooks, and there are places where I think the argument you're putting that civil society is part of the state and so on, you can read that into some parts of Gramsci. Elsewhere it isn't. To me, the crucial point that I take from it is that the kind of formal and informal organisations of civil society are voluntary. You know, it is up to me whether I join a trade union or not. There are regimes where you're forcibly enrolled in trade unions that are usually just arm of the state. That's not really. To say that Unison is an arm of the state doesn't really. Now, the Unison bureaucracy do all sorts of deals with the state, that's a different critique, right? But it doesn't really make, it's a voluntary organisation. Political parties, cultural associations, and yet these play an immense role in terms of cementing people into acceptance of the existing. And I think that's a brilliant insight by Gramsci, and one that's still quite interesting for us. A couple of other points. The difference between common sense and good sense. You see, I think that what Gramsci is saying is that most people brought up under capitalism have both a kind of element of acceptance of the system and therefore of some of its ideas, but also elements of rejection of it. Most people, and there's a shifting balance inside the working class, and even inside the individual's head, that people part accept capitalism and partly hate elements of it. One expression of that is that many, many workers accept that capitalism's here to stay. You know, you grew up under it, it seems all powerful, even though it's only been around 200 years, right? But they want changes. They partly reject it. So you accept that there has to be a boss and a free market and the profit, but you want an NHS, you want better pay, you want reforms, in other words. In other words, the dominant idea inside the British working class is, and has been for the last 150 years, is reform. And that reflects a combination of accepting the system and rejecting it. And I think Gramsci's notions of common sense and good sense and how they're intertwined in individual workers' heads is a very powerful tool for explaining the obvious reality that we find that most workers are not revolutionaries but accept elements of capitalism but also reject it. And the role of socialists is to try and seize on those elements that involve a rejection of it, to strengthen them, to clarify them, to render them more coherent, in other words, to drive out the ruling class common sense. And that you can do that with individuals, but it's much more effective when there are struggles, and particularly mass struggles. When workers are engaged in mass strikes or occupying their factories and so on, the potential to win people to the idea that you don't need a boss, that workers have the power to run society themselves, but in order to do so you have to overthrow the state, grows. It's more favourable, but you still have to consciously intervene, and therefore it's not automatic, but you need a revolutionary party. The question about religion. Gramsci has a lot of fascinating things to say. He's fascinated because he's interested in the ties that bind people to the system. In 1920, in much of rural Italy, the church was the key institution for binding people to, so he's fascinated by it. And because he understands that ruling class ideology isn't just something that's simply imposed on people, that it's something that's negotiated, and he understands that religion is a contradictory phenomenon. I think Conrad is completely right, that religion can both play an immensely conservative and reactionary role, but at other points historically, and your point about liberation theology, right, is one example, it plays a very different role. I mean, I grew up in a completely secular existence. When I went to university, and my lecturer said that if somebody stood in London in 1647 and said there's no king but Jesus, this was a revolutionary act in essentially an autocracy, right, run by a monarch. And you began to understand that religion isn't simply reactionary. At other points, it can play a more progressive role. And just as an aside, I think that one of the things that's been a hallmark of the Socialist Workers' Party's response to the sort of political question of Islam, a hugely important one in the last decade, is to understand, whereas sections of the left just see it as purely reactionary and so on, is to understand the contradictory role, how it can also give expression to oppression and so on, and therefore isn't something that you simply dismiss and so on, you have to engage with it. Final point, I just think it's just the final point to reflect on. See, it's interesting, isn't it? At the heart of Gramsci's account is what we talked about the role of civil society, these voluntary institutions binding people to the system. But think about Britain. I mean, that was Italy in 1920, right? Think about Britain today. I think in many ways the hallmark, and it's not just Britain, is that many of those voluntary organisations of civil society have atrophied and hollowed out. The most obvious example are political parties. The Labour Party at its height, an organisation that's always helped bind people in some ways to the system, right? Never been a revolutionary organisation. At its height in 1951 had 1 million members. The Labour Party today probably has a fifth of that, and it's a lot less active. I mean, in every neighbourhood, in every working class neighbourhood in 1951, there would have been well-known Labour Party activists, a Labour club, a social network, even a cultural life. Think of this, a cultural life around the Labour Party, right? This is far from the reality today. The Tory party, by the way, had 3 million members at its height. It was probably the most powerful and effective conservative, right-wing party in Western Europe. Today, I doubt it has 130,000 members, and part of the rise of UKIP is partly about the crisis of the Tory party and its deep erosion. So I think in some ways, some of those organisations that used to act as kind of shock absorbers and help tie people to the system have eroded. Now in some ways that makes it more difficult to sometimes mobilise against the system and so on. But it also, I think, means that in many ways the struggle is more explosive, more volatile, because some of those mediating structures between the ruling class and the mass of the population have been hollowed out, especially under the kind of neoliberal era. Why join the Labour Party? You don't see it delivering anything. So I think that we can't simply take Gramsci's account and impose it on the 21st. Much of Gramsci's account actually looks dated in terms of a different kind of society in the 1920s in Italy, a society that was only still partially industrialised. But I think it's very, very useful if you think through how that applies today and the role that a revolutionary party can play in terms of relating constantly to any struggle that takes place, but always looking to win individuals out of that struggle, to help clarify the ideas, to pull together a network of socialists who can intervene in the next struggle to make it more effective and so on, and to build up its forces, to take advantage of the sudden explosive struggles that can happen, especially in the context of the worst crisis that we've seen since the 1930s. And Gramsci's insights, I think, will repay people studying seriously, reflecting on, debating about their meaning, but constantly understanding how a revolutionary party has to constantly intervene, not just to uncritically celebrate and worship spontaneity, but to engage with it, to clarify it, and to win people to a rounded understanding of the system.